Okay, well, thank you everybody for being here. Um, this is Sustainable Sculpting with Eco-Friendly Mold Making. My name is Emily Blythe Jones, if I didn't say that already, and I'm co-hosting today with Sasha Fishman. She's actually driving down the coast right now after picking up hagfish for the hagfish slime that she's able to use for her bioplastic research. So that's pretty amazing. I happy that she's doing that. And while I'm at it, I'm just going to introduce her because we're going to be doing some future workshops together, which I'm really super thrilled about. We both have some interest in researching biomaterials and figuring out ways that we can be transitioning away from using plastics and silicones, rubbers, basically trying to make an effort to only be using biodegradable materials. So this is Sasha. She's part of Super Collider. She's a organizer, residency coordinator, and she's also doing a fellowship right now researching this bioresin. It's really incredible stuff. So it's funny how nervous I am because I used to teach, but you know, we're all in it. This is a new age. So I'm a sculptor and a painter, and I make figurative sculptures and have been for a while trying to figure out a solution for creating my sculptures using a more sustainable and eco-friendly method. And I was starting this whole project, figuring out what I could be using as far as materials go. I'm going to talk a little bit about where I got my start with that a little bit further down the line. But I was finding that I was really frustrated with how expensive mold making was, and how much waste I was creating, because I don't know about anybody else that is getting started with, you know, working with sculptural materials. It can be extremely expensive. And if you make mistakes, you're stuck with those mistakes unless you decide to dispose of those, and they're not always biodegradable mistakes. So it was really important for me to expand my tool bag and figure out a better way to be actually making my work in a sustainable way. So I was looking for material that was a really forgiving material, a compatible material with the modeling clays that I had already started using, reusable. So if I was going to be making a casting, I wanted to be able to make multiple castings, and also a material that was recyclable as well. So in my efforts to find something that would fit this bill, I came across some people that were doing some research into making molds with gelatin. And this is kind of one of these age-old materials that people have been using for a long time. And I'm going to be sort of kind of looking at the chat every once in a while just to make sure that I'm not missing something. Oh yes, sorry. Yes, Sasha is here. That's great. So, you know, in ages past, people were using gelatin because this has been something that we've been able to unlock for, you know, centuries, be able to make gelatin. I'm going to explain why, because it's really basic material. And I was really interested in the fact that a lot of artists are already using gelatin, especially within the special effects community. People will use gelatin as a temporary prosthetic where they can use witch hazel and blend all of the edges of the prosthetics that they make and be able to make like really awesome, you know, prosthetics like this guy's fingers up at the top there. And they use Pros Aid adhesive to be able to stick that to the face. Really weird stuff. I don't know about anybody else, but when you use raw gelatin, you might know that it kind of has an interesting smell to it. So it's just funny to me to imagine that being stuck to your face, but it works. And then there's also been a huge group of people that have been working with gelatin as a method of making a surface that will allow you to make monoprints. So you take a sheet of gelatin and then you put paint or ink on it. It's really forgiving. And then you slap some paper on there, bing, bang, boom, you've got a monoprint surface. It's amazing stuff. The problem is that it will start disintegrating, or it will start shrinking. It will get crumbly. It doesn't stay usable for very long. And so you have to stick it in the fridge or you have to remelt it. So you can remelt it. That's great. That's a really wonderful functionality. It's not, in my opinion, a thing that I want to be doing all the time. So they also make jelly print surfaces that are available like on Dick Blick, but something like a 16 by 20 inch surface, which is a nice size for making a decent sized print, it's $108, which is crazy, especially, I mean, it's reusable. It's not remeltable. It's not reconfigurable. So you're just spending $108 on a plate of jelly, of gelatin, where instead you can make one yourself. So I kept looking, I kept trying to figure out a way to make this work. And then I love YouTube so much. I went down the rabbit hole of YouTube and found this really awesome woman that's, her name is Joni Good. She is one of my favorite people in the world because she's just so enthusiastic. She's wonderful. She makes these beautiful masks out of paper mache. She's got all of these different recipes that she's worked on. And she introduced me to the concept of mixing in glycerin into the product. So she's got this jar there in that image where she has mixed glycerin, gelatin, she's melted it down. It's starting to come together in her mixture. She also adds water to it, which, as I continued researching, became a thing that a lot of the mold makers were experimenting with, is different levels of water. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. She introduced me to this fellow named Ken, who runs Observations blog. And he called himself at one point in his discussion terminally curious, which I just thought was absolutely wonderful. This is his method of experimenting with some of these different materials. So he's got a recipe on his website, and that's linked in the PDF. And he goes down and says, you know, you can add this amount of water, you can add this amount of glycerin, this amount of gelatin, and get a really lovely material that you can work with. He also has some speculations about what the actual durometer is. I'm going to talk about that in a second. But he just gets a little bit more scientific about it and plays around with some of these different materials that you can actually cast into there. And this is a great example of the pictures that he's got there of a candle being cast inside of that material. So the consensus ended up being, there was another woman named Sharon Giles who started using it as a printmaking method where she would mix the glycerin and the gelatin and the water, had great results. The consensus ends up being that glycerin is the thing that you need. So Ken again speculates there that it's around 40 in the durometer. Durometer is a scale that they use to determine how hard a material is by pressing a needle into the surface. And that's like a really, easy way of explaining that. But in the general scheme of things, I have agreed with him that the material that I'm making is around a 30 to a 40 durometer material, Shore A. Really amazing consistency. And what I then wanted to start doing is comparing it. So I started working with silicones. I started working with this glycerin gelatin. I've been expanding my mold making toolkit for a while. And I started kind of deciding what the actual comparison of this material to the rest of them was and what it could be used for and what it shouldn't be used for. So in comparison to something like Sorta-Clear, which is a really lovely material for creating food safe molds, I really like smooth-on products. They are, they're a really good option for people that are getting started off with mold making. There's a lot of different materials sold all over the world. They became sort of well known because of the fact that they market themselves really well and they're very open to experimentation for crafters and artists, special effects people. There's a place up in Burbank now called Reynolds Advanced Material, and that's where I go to get basically all of my materials, my resins and my all of my silicones. And so I was introduced to Sorta-Clear from up there. Sorta-Clear is great. You can get it in a wide range of durometers. The cost is a little bit higher than what I would have liked to be entering into. But the fact that you can keep these molds for the foreseeable future. It has excellent tear strength. There are even better silicones that are out there, but this one is compatible in, or comparable in some ways, with the glycerin gelatin. So I'm starting from there. If you're interested in silicone, we can go on a whole other rabbit hole with that. There's a variety of materials that can be cast into this silicone. It can be used as a positive. So if you wanted to make a posable stop motion animation figure, you can use silicone as that as well. Cons would be, cure inhibition is a really big problem with platinum silicone. There are only, yes, Reynolds is also in Chicago and on the East Coast. They've got a whole list of all of their different places on their website. And I've got the links to that in the PDF. So cure inhibition is a big problem. You put silicone, platinum silicone on something like anything that has ever touched anything that has latex on it. Like if you accidentally hold something that has, with latex gloves, and then you go to cast, mold something with platinum silicone, you can ruin your whole project. It's a big problem. And it's also permanent. So your problems then become permanent. It's got its problems, it's got its great benefits. A lot of people then will say, well, what's a really cheap version of something that's very permanent that I can use to make a lot of molds? A lot of people in the DIY crafting arts community will then recommend people to try out, if you're just getting started making molds and you're like, I really don't want to spend this money on this really great silicone. Where do you find the PDF? It's all the way up at the top of the chat. If anybody wouldn't mind popping that in there, that'd be awesome if it's not inconvenient. So the DIY silicone, you get it from the hardware store and you just pop it on whatever your master is. And you need to do some mold releasing with some materials, but it's really quite easy to work with. And it's actually one of the ways that I got started with mold making. I was working with my roommate at the time, my dear friend Farzan Sabet, who is the USC kiln tech, and he was like, I can make some stuff for you in the kiln. Do you want to try getting started with some mold making? I made all these clay hats, and then I wanted to make molds of those so that I could make duplicates. And I used silicone caulking by squirting the silicone into a bucket of soapy water, and then you put that on top. That's another whole method. There's a whole other body of people that are working with silicone caulking on YouTube that you can find. It's got some problems. It's got low tear strength. There's only one durometer unless you alter it with any other any other solution. And then it puts off this really intense smell from the acetic acid, not pleasant to work with. You need to put it on your master and then walk away. Don't be breathing that. It's not great. It's not all that cheap also in comparison, because of the fact that it's basically, 10 times use instead of 40 to 100, depending on your mold release. You can end up having molds that tear really easily, and that's super frustrating. You also can't make the molds very thick. So this is actually a really small mold that I have in this image. If you pour too much of the silicone caulking onto your master, it will not properly cure. You're going to have pockets of uncured silicone, and it takes a long time for that to cure. So it's not a great option, in my opinion. I love alginate. Alginate is phenomenal. It picks up incredible detail. You can also get it from Smooth On, Reynolds. You can get it, not just the AlgaSafe products, but AlgaSafe is the Reynolds material that they recommend that they carry. It has no free crystalline silica, which is a known carcinogen, so that's great. You can use it in your mouth. You can use it on your face. Really wonderful for body casting, and it's biodegradable. So the mistakes that you make are not going to live with you forever. Picks up perfect surface detail. It is not an inexpensive product. I would say it's not the most expensive as far as the products go, but because of the fact that it's non-reusable and it's non-recyclable, you are spending quite a bit of money per mold making that you are doing. It also requires a larger amount, although I recently just experimented with adding paper fiber to the actual material, which allowed me to do what's more so called like a brush on mold, where you brush the material over your master. I did it with my husband's feet. It worked great. Typically what you would need to do is do really thin layers, build them up with tissue in between, and then you end up making a jacket mold over that with yet another product that is non-recyclable and non-reusable for that particular mold. So you'd have to do plaster bandages built up over that mold. Not ideal. Or you have to do a whole solid block, and at which point you can cut that apart, but it's really, really difficult to reuse that mold. It's been done. I'm not going to say it's impossible, but it's definitely not a pleasant experiment. So in comparison, I'm going to break down some of like the benefits then of the gelatin and the glycerin. I go into a little bit more depth in that in the PDF, but I do have sort of a getting started kit that I've linked in there as well. And that contains some of the options that I would suggest for purchasing gelatin, purchasing glycerin. I personally end up buying really large quantities all of it at the same time because I go through a lot of it because I'm making large sculptures and I want to be able to have plenty of it on hand depending on what type of mold I'm making. So as a rule of thumb, I've observed that 16 ounces of gelatin equals 24 ounces of liquid glycerin because you're measuring by volume, not by weight. And when you melt that together, it equals 24 ounces of glycerin gelatin. So you want to keep that in mind when you're figuring out how much you want to be buying so that you can more properly approximate how much material you should actually buy. And I'm going to give you some handy tricks on how to determine the volume of whatever you're going to be molding. So that will come in just a moment. On the shopping list I do have some reusable products that you can use, but I use things like my old like pickle jars or yogurt containers, sour cream all the time. I would highly recommend that. I would say that buying some of the products that I have listed on there, like reusable stir sticks or silicone brushes, work really, really well, and you can just pop the material off unless you're using it for silicone on silicone, and even still, sometimes silicone doesn't always stick to itself really well. So take a look at the list. If you've got questions on that, would love to help you out with that. I will be just continuing to work on finessing how to get that information to you guys, but I have a spreadsheet that's a little bit robust for meeting that goal. So the next thing that I would want to talk about would be, what are you actually going to be making a mold of? So this material is really wonderful in that you can make a mold of basically anything that isn't going to melt when you put any amount of heat on it. So, and I say any amount because I would have expected a PLA 3D print to not have the easiest time being molded, but we just did a really quick experiment with that, with the little boat that they give you for testing 3D printing capabilities, or that you have to print for 3D printing, making sure all of your settings are done well. And it worked great. So this is a huge problem that people within the Benchy, thank you, my husband just reminded me. It's a huge problem within the mold making community. We're all very excited about the capabilities that can be unlocked with 3D prints. And yet silicone often will have cure inhibition when you put it onto your 3D prints. So I really wanted to make sure that if I was going to be getting excited about making any 3D prints with my husband's 3D printer, then I wanted to be able to be making molds of that. There we go. It works beautifully. So you can also do stuff with ceramics. You can do stuff with food as long as the food's not going to melt or cook inside of the mold. You're good to go. So I've used it on all sorts of weird foods. And my personal favorite is Monster Clay. Monster Clay is a waxy oil clay hybrid. It behaves very similarly to how when you're tooling wax and it's maybe not super fresh, or it's not sat for a while, it's maybe you've been handling it for a little while. That's like the way that Monster Clay starts out of the container. It's a delight to work with. I typically have both Monster Clay sculptures that I'm working on, and then I also work with water-based clay. So I keep separate water-based clay set aside for mold making purposes. And what I'll do is if I'm going to work on a larger scale, I'll work with water-based clay with an armature inside, and then I'll let that completely dry, and then I'll seal it with a PVA glue. And afterwards, I can still recycle my clay, break it down, recycle it, and then be able to reuse it for other purposes. The PVA doesn't negatively affect, it just dissolves back into the clay. A lot of people actually mix PVA glue into their clay to create a little bit of a paper clay effect. They'll mix it with paper. Another workshop I'd be very excited to talk about. So this is the basic list of things that you're going to want to have on hand while you are preparing your surface. I really like to have a piece of wax paper that I just put out, and I lay all my materials out, got everything ready. I've got my microwave nearby because I do a lot of this mold making in the kitchen. And then I also am really close by to where I keep, our fridge. The freezer is like my best friend in this whole procedure. So I will start often with a frozen monster clay, and I'm going to show you video of making all the way from the prototype itself, all the way to casting several different materials. I also think that at some point, depending on how we're looking on time, I'd like to give you guys, my friend Virginia did a workshop recently and she called it a bio break, which I think is great. You just give people an opportunity to get up and go pee or drink some water or whatever. So before I start the video, I think I'm going to check and make sure that nobody has any questions, and also give you guys a moment to do that, if that works for everyone. Yeah, that's the next video. So let me check in. Does anybody have any questions on the chat at all? If anybody wants to unmute themselves, you're welcome to do so. I'm going to give us just like, let's say until 4:30, and then I'll go ahead and get started with all of the videos. But how is everybody doing? Does anybody have any questions so far? Is the PDF helpful? Can I comment at all on that? We're looking good. That's good. Doing great. Okay. Well, I'm going to take a sip of my coffee. I have the mold that I made sitting here. Pretty excited to get to show that to everybody. And then I've got a couple examples of the castings that I've made as well. I did the research. I wanted to make sure that if I was proposing this as a solution for how to swap out of making non-biodegradable, that I really wanted to be able to have all of that information ready for you guys. So it's great. Smelly oils to the gelatin to remove the smell. Yeah, so I have talked to some people about, I have talked to some people about being able to deal with the smell. When I first started using this material, I was really bummed out about how much it smelled. I've completely gotten used to it. But I did talk to somebody on, I don't know if anybody else has gotten really into all of the Facebook groups that are available. I mean, Facebook is a really intense place, but it's really lovely to be able to find some forums where you can go and talk about some of the trials and tribulations of continuing to try to make. So I talked to somebody who had met me through one of these groups, and they said that they couldn't work with the material anymore, but I personally got used to it. But I tried putting some like essential oil in there when I first started, and then that ended up smelling even worse. So if you've got success with a particular essential oil smelling good, I'd give it a shot. I'd love to hear what anybody else is using. Okay, so Sebi, you just talked about the plaster casting into the gelatin molds, and that's That's a huge thing that I'm going to be talking about. I did find some workarounds. So stay tuned. Juliana, I have done research on using pectin. That's another thing that I'm going to talk about a little bit towards the end. I try to not eat a lot of meat in my daily life. I'm really excited about some of the meat substitutes because I still like the flavors of meat. But I'm really bummed about the fact that I'm using a product that is a byproduct of gelatin. I go into the history of gelatin quite a bit in the PDF. You know, where it comes from, what it is as far as a byproduct. I learned about knackers, who are the people that come around and have to be trained on how to properly dispose of deceased animals. And a lot of times they will be working with gelatin manufacturers for that purpose. But they have to be really well trained because they're preventing the spread of disease through their work. So, you know, glycerin's got that kind of problem to it. And something that Sasha and I are really excited about doing is continuing to do some research. So the other day, Sasha and I were talking on the phone, and she's just like, hey, I'm going to do a test. We're going to try out agar. And it worked a little bit more similarly to the glycerin gelatin mixture than pectin did. Pectin, as far as I am aware, is not on the table, but we've got some further experimenting to do with agar, maybe some of the other seaweeds. But check out some of the research that I linked in the PDF if you're curious. I don't want to spend too much time going into the history of glycerin and gelatin, but it is in there in case you're interested. And let's get back started, unless I missed anything else in the chat. Yeah, Paul Reynolds, I would love to hear about what essential oils you used. There are some wax candle smell additives. That was kind of what I used. Have I had any problems with mold growing on the material? I did not have any problems when I was working with water, but I was concerned that that was going to be a little bit more of a problem. When you incorporate water into the mixture, that oftentimes will create a little bit more of a moist environment, which can create mold, bacterial growth. I just nix the water. So I'm going to talk about that. Yeah, agar is exciting. Okay, let me get back to it. Last thing before I get into this, I'm going to be creating a library of diagrams that are a little bit more easily understood. I was surprised when I went to go look for descriptions of different types of molds that there are not a lot of diagrams that actually show what different types of molds are. And everybody that is part of the mold making community, these different forums that I'm part of on Facebook and on Reddit and on Instagram, they all talk about the fact that there is a real issue with our vocabulary is not very solidified. So there's a lot of different terms for a lot of different things within the mold making world. And I'm going to be trying to stick to a specific vocabulary so that it's easy as I'm teaching these workshops or if I'm making these videos. But I did want to just kind of go through very basically. There are 1 part block molds that you cut apart. There are 1 part open face molds, what are, like, people will call them slab molds or dump molds. And that's just you take your material and you pour it over your master, your prototype. There's 1 part glove molds where you don't actually cut them off. You just actually remove it just like you would with a glove. It'll be great for small objects. Really good for silicone or this glycerin gelatin material when you've added some water to it and it's a little bit of a softer durometer. That's really helpful. And then you get into the 2 part molds. And I'm really excited. I'm going to be doing some demonstrations later on. I've already recorded some of the video for making a 2 part block mold where I figured out something that you can do to create a parting seam within the 2 halves of the block mold. So it's very exciting. I have to throw a huge thank you to my friend Joshua Golden and Emily Hamilton. They worked with me on creating some of these videos that I'm going to show you. And I think that they turned out really fun. So huge thank you to them. We were working on that for a while and this is it. So I'm starting off with a mold box. this is the sculpture that I worked on. I actually took this sculpture from an old sculpture that I am going to be giving to another artist in an artist trade. And I was like, well, you know, I love this sculpture. It's really wonky, but I want to be able to make a new version of it. This is a woman that my grandma was friends with back in Wisconsin, and really like her sort of disgruntled face that she's giving. So what I'm doing is I'm cutting apart these blocks of cheap oil clay from Sargent. And if you have any questions about this process, let me know, but also I've got it detailed in the PDF. So I put that whole sculpture into the freezer and I let it freeze overnight. And then I keep putting it back and forth in the freezer so that it doesn't thaw at all. And then I'm making that mold box so that I can make this open face mold. So let me make sure I don't click to the next one. Oh, I did. Okay. So now I've got my mold box created, and I'm going to figure out now how to determine the volume. What the sculpture is made out of monster clay. That's the clay that I mentioned earlier. That's the oil-based clay. So I've poured a bunch of rice into that material, into that mold box, and I'm now going to take the rice and I'm going to put it into my measuring cup and figure out the volume that I need to actually measure out of the glycerin and gelatin. I didn't do this the most elegant way. I got rice all over the place. It still worked. It was great. I do recommend, if you're going to be doing this, fill your mold maybe about like an inch or so higher than where the very tallest peak of your master is. The reason being that there is a chance that you're not going to get a completely accurate representation of the volume. Like I was off by just a little bit, and I talk about that a little bit more. So I'm figuring out how much I need to actually measure out of the glycerin and the gelatin. This ended up being 7.5 cups of glycerin gelatin, divided that in half, measured out 50-50 by volume. I am really into not adding the water, so I'm just doing 50-50 by volume. You can modify that amount a little bit. If you add a little bit more glycerin or a little bit more gelatin, you're going to get a different consistency. And I would encourage you to play around with it and see what you think of that. So I am now getting ready to mix up the glycerin gelatin mixture. I just buy these big jugs from Amazon because it's the cheapest way to get this. And then I buy like a pallet of the gelatin. Very eager to find a solution for not buying so much gelatin because it seems obscene, but pour that in there. What I'll usually actually do is just pour the gelatin into my bowl, and then I'll fill that container back up with the liquid glycerin. So I'm not even worrying about using a measuring cup. Just easy like that. But I'm figuring out how much of the glycerin I need at that point. This is food safe glycerin. I'm not going to be mixing this batch with any of my other previous batches where I'm not sure if I've ever had any other materials mixed into that. So sometimes it's really nice to be able to use a mold release that's meant for silicone while you just, spray some of that in there. That makes for a really easy mold release, but then you can't use that for anything that is ever going to be used for food purposes. So a lot of people will use cooking oil as a mold release. But this is going to be just a pure batch of the glycerin gelatin, and I'm not going to be adding anything into that that's not food safe. While you're mixing this up, you want to make sure that you've got all of the little clumps of gelatin completely incorporated into the glycerin, and it turns into that kind of milky quality. It's pretty gross looking and smelling. I wish that you guys could be hearing the oh, Alenka, what a great idea. Place a thin plastic bag in the mold first before laying in the rice. That way you can just pull up the bag and pour it into the bowl instead of picking it up grain by grain. That makes perfect sense. Thank you so much for sharing that technique. Really excited about that. Okay, so now you're gonna heat up the mixture. I like to use my microwave, really simple, really easy. I'll do 2-minute bursts at a time. And I think here I'm doing it at full power. Sometimes what I'll do is I will set my microwave at, 15 minutes at like 4%, 40% power, and then go outside and exercise the dog. And it's great. Works really well. I don't have to sit there and baby it because I did a really good job of mixing that all up beforehand. And then I'll just come back into the house, do a nice, like, make sure that it's all incorporated, all mixed up. And what you're seeing there, I'm not quite ready for it to be used for the mold. So I'm going to put it back into the microwave again. And when I'm lifting up the spatula like that, I'm looking to see that the translucency has turned a little bit more like honey. It doesn't have any of that kind of milky quality to it. And this is the color that you're going to be looking for, the translucency that you're going to be looking for when you haven't added any of the water into the mixture. So now I'm going to pour the material into the mold box. I just took the mold back out of the freezer. I'm going to dry it off, make sure that there's no moisture in there. Sometimes little beads of moisture can create little pockets that you don't want. So I dry that off. It's especially important if you're not adding, moisture in there. Otherwise, to just make sure that you're not adding anything additional into the mix. So yeah, I wipe that off. And then there's a couple little tricks that I use from while you're casting, when you're molding with silicone. What people will do is they'll hold the container of silicone as high up. And this is if you don't have a degassing chamber, your vacuum chamber. You'll hold it high up and you pour to the lowest peak first. And what that does is that allows you to have the material gradually fill up, and it lessens the chance that there's any bubbles that get formed. When you're doing it with silicone, especially a lower viscosity silicone, you actually pour from high up and you stretch the bubbles out. Thank you so much for coming, Paul. I'm going to be putting the video up on YouTube. Really appreciate it. So you're stretching the bubbles out as you pour it. Here, I'm just showing you how strong this material can be, and that's a really thin layer of this material. And I'm really like pulling on it at that point. I have not actually determined the temperature that this material gets to. I get it on my skin. It doesn't feel great, but it's not something that's like boiling water level. What I've heard is that gelatin melts at 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So you don't want to let the material burn either. If you let the material burn, if you put it on your double boiler and you forget about it and it's all of a sudden bubbling, you don't want to use that because it's not going to have any of the strength. It requires not reaching boiling temperatures. So I wouldn't recommend trying to get it on you. Why do I freeze the original? I freeze the original because of the fact that monster clay melts at a really low temperature. And, like you can be handling monster clay and it will actually start to loosen up to the point where it's easy to manipulate, which means that you need to freeze the material, whatever you're going to be doing, if it's a material that can melt. So if you're working with plastic and you're worried about it, put it in the freezer for a little while. If you're working with monster clay, or if you're working with wax, put it in the freezer, and that takes care of that problem. So I have now let the mold completely cool. I did this overnight. Just decided that I didn't want to even touch it or bother with it. I sometimes will put the whole mold box and the mold very carefully back into the freezer. In the PDF, I talk a little bit about how you can try to remove any of the bubbles that get trapped as it's cooling. It's still a little bit more translucent. Sometimes what I'll do when I'm worried about making sure that the surface is completely clean, I will do a very thin layer first and let it pour over the surface. And then I'll check for bubbles. I'll let that cool, and then I'll move on to the next pours. So here I'm just making sure that I've got all of the cheap oil clay removed. I don't want that to be mixing into any of the oil clay itself. So I've peeled all that off. You want to make sure that it also is not stuck to the mold itself, because if that gets melted into the mixture, it can cause these little pockets later on. They're super frustrating. You don't want to have to deal with that. I've got another mold making tutorial that I'm going to show at some point where I'm making a clock, and I did these really delicate little numbers, and I didn't put it in the freezer for long enough. I went to go pour the hot glycerin over it, and it ended up distorting a little bit. So now I've got these kind of like stringers that got left inside the mold. It's kind of cool if you want to play with it like that. So I've demolded the monster clay positive. the Monster Clay Master there. You can see some bubbles in the surface of this mold. For me, because of the fact that I do a lot of work on the surface after the fact, I'm not that concerned. But if somebody's making something that's a really beautiful epoxy casting and you want it to be really, really gorgeous, you might want to take your time a little bit more. You might want to make sure that you've got the material poured very gradually and that you're not getting any bubbles captured on the surface of that mold. If you've got some questions on that later, I'd be happy to offer any suggestions on that too. So that brings me to kind of the next chapter. I've got my mold. I've showed you how sort of flexible it is, what you can do with that. This is, again, a very simple open face, 1-part mold. And so it opens up some of the possibilities for what you can cast into it. I, in this application, wanted to have a mold that's open face so that it's very easy for me to show how I cast into a material like that using what's called a layup technique. And layup techniques usually come along with some sort of burlap or some sort of fiberglass technique material. I'm going to be using it with a workaround, like we talked about a little bit further up the chat where somebody was asking about plaster. This is the workaround that I have found. So in this image, I've got examples of some of the aspirational miniatures is what I call them. And these are like 2 years old at this point. I actually just sold a couple of them, let them go because I'm ready to be improving my techniques, improving my sculpting capabilities. And this is what's so exciting about this material is that you don't have to be committed to the things that you make in the same way that you would be if you had a permanent mold. So you can see an example here of what happens when you just try casting directly plaster into one of these glycerin gelatin molds. Found out about it from Joni Good, from Ken. I was so thrilled. Ken had tried out working with plaster and didn't say too much about the negative impacts that the surface of the plaster experiences. But when I took this out of the mold, I discovered that, I don't know if you can see on his face there, everything's kind of sandblasted looking. The core of the sculpture is still intact. And that means that, like, if you were going to do a large scale sculpture, this is still a viable option to just pour a bunch of plaster into one of these molds. It doesn't maintain the surface quality. So I needed to find a workaround. I tried Sculptamold. Sculptamold is a material that's based off of taking the gypsum material and then adding paper pulp. I love this stuff. It's fantastic. Some of these sculptures are actually made with the Sculptamold, and it also didn't provide the same kind of detailed retention that I wanted. So then I started working around with like trying to figure out a way to add acrylic to the surface of the mold as a barrier. Tried working with different glues, wasn't thrilled with the outcome of either of those solutions. And then I remembered that I had, back in 2015, went up to Cal State Summer Arts program in Monterey Bay. And I was so fortunate to get to work with these two incredible artists. My professor, Christian Tedeschi, brought these two up from Los Angeles. Katie Grinnan works with thermoplastic. So this piece is actually made out of thermoplastic, which is wonderful stuff. It's reusable, it's non-toxic, it can be molded after just pouring into hot water. I'm going to be doing some demonstrations of that later on down the road. And then Evan Holloway introduced us to working with aqua resin and working with Sculptamold. So Sculptamold was already something that I was really into. The aqua resin is the big deal for me here. Aqua resin is a polymer modified gypsum. So instead of using water for that, you're replacing that with the polymer. So Betsy, you're asking about the plaster, the exotherm. The reason why I don't think that it's specifically just the exotherm that's created in the plaster is that I've worked with other hot materials where the material itself doesn't degrade the surface of the mold. It just needs to be frozen in order for you to still use it. I think that there's something chemically going on. This is something that Sasha and I are hopefully going to be talking about in the future as to why the plaster can't be used in the glycerin gelatin, why it's not working. You also used the word moulage, which I'm really excited about. That's a material, a proprietary material that I'm going to talk a little bit more about as well, that Dick Blick will sell for a really decent price. It's an alternative, and it's also billed as being, I don't know if it's just the warm water, because it's not, Sebi asked in the chat, it might be just the warm water dissolving it. Again, I don't think that it's about the water, and I don't think that's about the warmth. So something's going on. In any case, we have a workaround. The acrylic resin, the acrylic polymer modified gypsum is that workaround, and I'm absolutely just ecstatic about it. So this is an image of Katie Grinnan showing us how to use thermoplastic inside of a silicone loom. Oh, Olenka. It's a good thing for us to look into. The Sculptamold was the one thing that we learned. We also learned the aqua resin and then the friendly plastic pellets. This is just some of the artwork that we made. Christian Tedeschi showing it off in our Cal State Northridge gallery there, one of the small ones. And the polymer opened up this whole new world for me, because all you have to do is create a single barrier layer of that polymer, the polymer modified gypsum, and you can use a really small amount of fiberglass. You can even just put it in as a gel coat. Gel coat is a term in the vocab sheet, where it's either in reference to the molding process or the casting process, but it captures all of those initial fine layer details. So if you put a gel coat of the aqua resin into your mold and then put backing layers of subsequent layers of gypsum, that means you're golden, you're solid. And that means that you don't have to be spending all of the money that comes with the additional costs of having that polymer modifier. So I started off with working with aqua resin. I really love it. It's got kind of a bone color. It's like a creamy, bony color. It's really lovely, but I ended up switching over to Duo Matrix Neo, which is a smooth-on product. It's a little bit more of a bright white color right out of the mixing. And you can, I've actually kept using the aqua resin fiberglass. They've got this really, really delicate mesh fiberglass that they sell. And I use that with the Duo Matrix. Oh, okay, Olenka is suggesting, I hear that brushing on a solution of alum dissolved in water into the gelatin mold will harden it, and that will help retain the details. Definitely, let's talk later, because that sounds really interesting. So, and that would hopefully help be able to move people just to be able to work with the gypsum itself. Right now, I'm really still into the idea of incorporating one of these polymer modifiers, because you are able to access some of the neat things like having a higher flame rating. I just saw this artist the other day who's using aqua resin and puts it as a coating with a larger structure that they make, and they've got it as a fireplace, which I think needs to be kind of worked out a little bit. There might be some things that they're doing that are, you know, behind the scenes, but there's a lot of really exciting potential about what Fortin does. You go to Vegas and you see all of those gorgeous sculptures that look like they're bronze. They're usually going to be something like a polymer modified gypsum that has copper or bronze or gold powder inlaid into that surface. And that's called cold casting. And that's something that I've gotten into quite a bit with working with both the polymer modified gypsums and with urethane resins. So the Fortin VF812 is what I'm currently working on, but I'm going to show you a demonstration of working with the Duo Matrix Neo. It's basically the same thing. The reason why I like to work with the Fortin VF812 is because you mix it yourself, which means that you can have a big old bucket of this Fortin VF812, only mix it into the first layer, but then it works with Hydrocal FGR95, which is a fiberglass reinforced Hydrocal product. It's got really nice high, got great benefits. You should look into it if you're interested in gypsum. Works best with the Fortin VF812. So that's my current situation. Quikrete acrylic fortifier available at Home Depot is a good alternative for VF812. That is wonderful information, Kim. Thank you so much. Kim's doing some really exciting work with marble dust. I'm very excited about her work. So I'm going to jump into actually casting with the polymer modified gypsum. This is the Duo Matrix I am going to be using cornstarch as my mold release. So I'm just using an old makeup brush and I'm dusting that into the surface. It's really going to show off all of my little bubbles and stuff. But because of the fact that I'm working actually with clay and then the gypsum with this later on, it doesn't bother me at all. So my apologies if this is not up to code for some of you that do a little bit more clean work, but that is not me. I've got this silicone jar that I use for any time that I'm working with a rigid material, because you can just squeeze the sides of the silicone mixing container. This is my the liquid polymer, and I got a little bit of gloopiness there. It's a little bit thickened, which is not great. So make sure that you shake that really well. I'm now adding some yellow ochre that I got from Laguna Clay. That's just straight up yellow ochre, and I mix that into the dry component, which is the gypsum component, and I mix that directly in there. It does modify the texture of the material a little bit, so I end up actually adding a little bit more of the liquid polymer component. I do that here, just because it doesn't super negatively impact the performance of the polymer modified gypsum. It makes it actually a little bit more flexible if you're only using it with just the polymer modified gypsum, if you're not backing it with something like a rigid surface behind. So then I just pour it into the mold. I kind of really wanted to show you guys how like not precise I work with this stuff. Again, this might totally make people cringe, but it's how I do it. So I'm making sure that I'm getting it into all of those little nooks and crannies, all of the little details, including all the little bubbles. At this point, I could be adding additional layers of the fiberglass in there to further reinforce it. I decided to just move from working with the gel coat, and then you can see in the picture there that the quality, the glossiness has gone away, which means that it's cured, and I'm now able to move on to the backing layer. I'm going to back with just gypsum, the Hydrocal FGR 95. You can't, I made a mess there. That's lovely. He went back for a second shot. We watched this last night. I didn't catch that he went back for a second shot of my mistake. Lovely. So with FGR, you need to measure it out. It's by weight. So this is 100 parts of the gypsum to 30 parts water, and that creates the right consistency for the gypsum. You don't want to do that like by hand, the way that some people will do with like plaster for doing either castings or for making molds for ceramics. You want to make sure that you're really precise with this stuff so that you can get the best strength properties that you're going to want to get out of the FGR. So I'm going to mix more of the yellow ochre directly into the gypsum. And I'm just using a recyclable, reusable little plastic mixing spoon that I've had for ages. I'm pouring the gypsum into the water, the measured out water at this point. Please make sure that you're wearing a mask anytime that you're working with gypsum. It's not good to be breathing that in. So I've got masks abound all around my studio ready for this sort of application, and definitely make sure that you're using that. And then I use this with burlap that I get pretty cheap from the hardware store. I've actually started moving over to working with just loose hemp. I just got a huge bale of it from Silpack Dan up in North Hollywood. And that's a really nice substitute for that. So you don't have to be spending quite as much, because burlap can get a little bit expensive, especially if you're using a lot of it. But it's meant for garden supplies, so it shouldn't be overly expensive. So I've got my wax paper out and just making sure that I've got my surface clean and protected as I start demolding. You just really carefully demold. I've got a couple spots where I didn't get great little spots on the edge where I'm going to have to do a little bit of work, and I'm going to tell you what I do for making those repairs. So I've got Epoxy Sculpt. Epoxy Sculpt is a epoxy clay. They sell it at Reynolds Advanced Materials. They sell it on Amazon. They also have stuff like Magic Sculpt, which is a great product. They have Freeform and Freeform Air that they sell through Smooth On. Those are great products. I just like to have the epoxy sculpt on hands, and I mixed the yellow ochre directly into that. And then I just made all of my repairs, all of my little patches with that. Maybe I can show that one more time. That was really fast. It was like 10 minutes sped up. So I mix that clay up in my hands. I'm wearing gloves. Make sure that you wear gloves. And then I just stick the wad into the yellow ochre, and I incorporate yellow ochre into that. And then I'm spreading that onto any areas. It dries, a little bit darker, but it's really good stuff to have on hand. Really, really recommend it. Now I'm cleaning off the mold. If you are going to be using this mold for anything else, especially clay, you want to make sure that this mold is really, really clean, because any particles of plaster that get into water-based clay and then you plan on firing it, that is a no-go. It's not a good idea. It can make your surface pop. So this is the moment that I'm like the most excited about. This is the moment where I'm realizing that gelatin is hygroscopic, which means that it's going to draw moisture away from the surface of whatever water-based clay or whatever latex, whatever material that you're putting into your mold that requires having moisture drawn out of it is going to work great in this. So I mixed up some Sannyware prepared slip, and I actually mixed it with dry slip and made a really kind of wet mixture and put that in with slabs, and then built up the sides. And then I also built up a back as well. All throughout this process, I'm able to use the mold itself to cradle that sculpture while I'm working on it. Dave Spear says, I believe that the hygroscopic property is why straight plaster doesn't work well in gelatin. That makes perfect sense. I'm still curious about the alum to see if that creates any beneficial properties, but this is very exciting. I feel like we're kind of workshopping together on this. This is great. So I experimented with the Sannyware, put that directly into the mold. I wasn't thrilled. Actually, the first casting that I did with B-Mix, and I put it directly into the mold straight out of the bag. I wedged it up, and it was a little bit too dry. And so what I ended up having to do was kind of press it into the surface like you would with a press mold that was made out of gypsum or plaster. Didn't have great results. So like some of the features ended up getting a little bit smushed, which isn't great, but that's okay because of the fact that I'm still able to work the surface of it because it's clay, as opposed to all of the Sebi. Did I try it with clay slip? So yes, I did it with the B-Mix straight out of the bag, wedged it up, put it in as slabs, wasn't thrilled. Then I did the wetter version with the Sannyware, where I mixed the prepared slip, added some of the dry slip to it, got it to kind of be like not really usable if I was doing anything other than this process. The last one that I did was with clay slip, just straight up Sannyware, and it was amazing. Like, this is like the reason why I'm excited about doing this workshop, is because there's a lot of ceramicists out there that would benefit from being able to have nostrils that are carved, or have ear cavities, or have sides of faces where you want to be able to pour liquid slip into this mold and have good results from it. And for the longest time, I didn't know that it was possible. And then I tried it the other day, and it was great. So yes, it works with clay slip. It also works with latex, which is a huge thing it works with silicone beautifully. I love latex. It doesn't have the same library life. It doesn't have the same properties that silicone does. But when you're wanting to make like a mask or a prosthetic and you want it to be lightweight and wearable, latex is amazing. So this is balloon latex that comes as a liquid jar that you get. Actually, have it right here because I haven't cleaned up after my workshop. But this is from Berman Industries, and this is high-grade balloon rubber, pre-vulcanized thin natural latex. And you just pour it in just like you would with slip. And what you do with the slip casting process is you let moisture evaporate into the surface of the mold, traditionally with plaster. and then you pour off all of the liquid excess. How long did I leave the slip in my mold, Nicole? The reason why I'm actually not going to be showing video of that process yet is because I haven't figured out the correct protocol for something of this size. I think I left it sit for maybe an hour, which is longer than I would typically do for if I was doing it with plaster. But I did want to make sure that because of the fact that you've got some bits of undercuts, you've got, why the yellow ochre beside for the pigmentation, mineral content? Yes, yellow ochre was just for coloring. I'm really into yellow coloring. So Nicole, as far as how thick did it cast, I was going for maybe about, you know, a quarter of an inch or so. Left it sit for a while. I ended up letting it sit, letting it kind of evaporate into the mold for a while, and then did some areas where I had to take some of the wet clay and reinforced it, did some areas where I had to like scoop out too much of the water clay. So it's very exciting. It still needs a little bit more experimentation. So the detail retention though is outstanding. I mean, this is the Sannyware clay slip that I poured directly into the mold. I left it sitting in the mold for quite some time. I was able to work on the walls of the vessel that I'm creating there, all while it was still in the mold, which means that I get additional, you know, structural integrity while I'm working on the sides. And then when I flipped it over, it was beautiful. So stay tuned. I'm going to be updating that the whole procedure with slip casting with a little bit more information in the future. And the next thing that I wanted to show you was just how easy it is to actually recycle and break down this mold. So I should have probably taken some, this was actually the previous mold that I had done some initial slip casting experiments with, and just kind of wanted to get a sense of, you know, whether it was going to actually work before I did it with my good mold that I had just made. So I break down this glycerin gelatin, and I actually used a little bit of it to top off the good mold, which is also right here. So I didn't cut this one up yet. I might still make stuff with it. Still excited about that. But I just take a really sharp X-Acto knife and a cutting board, and you chop it up, and then you make sure that all of those little bits are clean, wiped off, and then you stick it in the microwave, and that's it. It doesn't need any sort of special treatment. So here I wanted to, did I suction out the liquid slip after casting or pick it up and pour? I did pick it up and pour, but suctioning it out would probably be a way better option because it was a little bit of a big mold. That would probably have been great. So I'm still, you know, pretty new in the world of slip casting. I just got my first kiln. I'm really diving into it. I'm really doing a lot of research, and I'm really excited about all of the possibilities that I can, you know, unlock with being able to slip cast, but I still need to do some work on that. So if you've got any, you know, suggestions for how I can improve or what I can add to these workshops, I would love to talk. So last year we had some artists come here from Rotterdam. We had an amazing time. They stayed at my house with me, and we ended up wanting to make a lighting structure that would hang over the exhibit that we showed through this collab project where it was an exchange project with the Monte Vista Projects, which I'm one of the members of, and then their group. And what we did is we wanted to have like a shell that could go around a light, and they all turned out a little bit full of character. It was a super fun process. And what we did is I took a monster clay sculpture, put the glycerin gelatin on top of that, and then we experimented with casting 65D, which is a smooth cast product from Smooth On. And I wasn't optimistic about, you know, whether urethane products could work with this. I had done some experimentation in the past. Urethane in particular does not like any moisture. There is just enough moisture left in this glycerin gelatin material where something like a 57D, which is meant for rotocasting and is fairly clear, it will not work in there. So I actually have a slide next where I'm going to show you what happened when I tried that. Didn't work, but if you do an initial casting of either the polymer modified gypsum, which can be cast very thin, very translucent, or something like the 65D, which is also from Smooth On, works as a rotocasting resin, and it's a semi-rigid resin. great for making something like this. And then we backfilled it with additional layers of the 57D just for a little bit more additional strength, because we wanted to maintain that translucent quality. It's really, really super fun. So that worked. This is a not working situation. So the far left is an image of me attempting to use the 57D as the initial coating. And then I backfilled it with all of this foam. And then I took it out of the mold and I was like, oh my God, I just wasted all of this foam. It was a shame. Not the end of the world. I just redid it. So the mold didn't degrade at all when I added the urethane. I cleaned it out, and then I did a subsequent casting with just working with the polymer modified gypsum. I think I used the aqua resin for that. So Dave Spear says, a couple years ago, I tried Ken's observation blog recipe with the water, tried some smooth on products, it was no go. But recently tried with the 50-50 recipe with the 325 and it cured fine. So yes, Dave, the far right is a little postcard sized work that I sent to my friends in Rotterdam as part of that project. And it is the copper powder that I did the cold casting method with. I tinted my 325 urethane resin with a little bit of, I think, brown and black, and then poured that into a dusting on the mold of the copper powder. And that's how you do one method of cold casting. That's like a surface method. You can also do it where you actually incorporate copper or bronze into the urethane itself, which means that if you have to end up doing any sort of working of the surface, that the material is deeper in, so you're not going to remove any sort of just surface coating. Cold casting, really, really super cool. You can do some really amazing stuff with the pigments, with the effects, with the metallic, you know, lots of different stuff. I go to this place called Mark's Paints in North Hollywood, and that's where I get all of my metallic pigments. It's really good stuff. This is a project that I did over February for a show. Bozo Mag hosted me for the ALAC this last February. And so the guy I constructed using the glycerin gelatin, this is the same layup method. And then what I did is I smushed those two halves together and filled up that cavity. And that was a lot. I was able to do, you know, what's basically a 2-part block mold. I ended up cutting that with a jeweler's cut so that it would fit back together. But I'm going to talk more about how you can make sculptures in the round and not just a relief or an open face, because this allows you to be able to just pour into that cavity, but still have some of the benefits of that polymer modified gypsum coating. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you so much. In the future, I'm going to be doing some workshops where I'm going to be talking a little bit more about some of the different stuff that I do with this material. I'm going to go over in more detail how I use the liquid clay and the liquid latex. I'm going to show you examples of what I've accomplished so far. Still have quite a ways to go with that. But I mean, like, this is super fun. Like, this is the sculpture, this is her, and I could do anything I want with that. So I want to show you guys how I'm doing that, what latex is really cool for. I'm going to do a demonstration of how to do rotocasting with urethane resin. I love urethane resin rotocasting because it conserves materials. I'm like all about anything that can conserve costs. How to use glycerin gelatin as a jelly plate. So I've actually started developing some procedures for myself for how to combine woodblock style printing, where you've got, you know, relief areas that you've carved, with casting, with mold making, and then also incorporating the jelly plate aspects where you can add the monoprint aspect directly to the surface of that jelly plate. I'm really excited to share this with people that are interested in painting and printmaking, because of the fact that it becomes this really excellent resource that you can use for creating really fast relief carvings. So I've done some stuff where, you know, you make a mold of something that's a specific depth the whole way through, and then you make a mold of that, you flip it over, and you can ink that up just like you would with a relief plate. So I'll explain that a little bit more. 2-part mold with parting seams, cornstarch, freezing, super cool, really great way to go into that. and then modifying this glycerin gelatin with additives to create more of a brush on mold consistency. I've also experimented with doing that, where you add micro balloons, or you add Cabasil, which is a little bit on the, you need to be aware of breathing that in is really dangerous. A lot of these stuff, you know, the powder materials are really dangerous to work with. So you need to make sure that you're masked up, just like you do with ceramics. And then also, you know, what benefits can you get from adding water to this mixture? Is there a way to modify the 50-50 whole breakdown so that you can get a little bit more of a viscous material, so that you're not getting as many of the air pockets? I've actually experimented a little bit with burning the material, which you don't want to do, but like I had an old batch and I experimented with burning it. It takes on a more deep caramely color, and then it actually is a little bit more viscous when you pour it. It sort of settles a little bit more clearly. Yeah, Betsy, Cabasil, not good stuff. I do have the alternative, and I think that it is considered like more of like a micro balloon kind of thing. Cabasil is fumed silica, so you want to be really careful with that. Patty said, I've used my glycer gel with some plat silicone. Yes, I have done tests with platinum silicone. Works really well. I have used it for making stuff where I'm wanting to make, you know, puppets, and I want to be able to have them be a positive that is silicone. Did a really tiny test to start off with, because you always want to make sure you don't have anything that's going to create any cure inhibition. Works great. As far as Sebi goes, the question I think you were asking about the working it with as a gel plate, you do need to make sure that you're carving deep enough if you're going to be doing it that way. But like, for example, if I inked up that hand there, that would create some really great printmaking qualities. So Andrea, thank you so much. Polyethylene fibers are a good alternative. I have been messing around with nylon fibers. I've also been working with diatomaceous earth, which is a really nice, you know, it's crustacean matter. Look into diatomaceous earth if you're all curious. It's kind of like a cure-all thing. You can use it for fleas and stuff. It's good stuff. So I've mixed that into the glycerin gelatin, and that creates a little bit more of a brush-on material. And then I want to show you how I didn't touch on this in this workshop, but thermoplastic is a really great option for creating a mother mold. So rather than having to use plaster bandages, or rather than having to use an epoxy fiberglass shell, instead you can use thermoplastic, which means that you don't have to be married to having this empty shell if you don't keep the mold. I needed to figure out a way how to make a non-permanent jacket mold or mother mold. So I'm going to go ahead and show that in a future demonstration. And I'm very keen on getting future feedback. I would love to have conversation with people. I've got a whole list of questions, things that I want to answer as far as like, why isn't this working perhaps? What can be done to modify this? Really, really eager to have like a discourse opened up with everybody that is experimenting with this. I feel a little bit like selfish in that I'm putting this workshop out, but I just want us to be creating like a community where we can solve some of these problems and talk through some of these issues, and also just be reducing our plastic waste. You know, that's like the biggest thing for me. I get a little bit like fanatical about the whole idea of knocking out so much of the plastic waste that's created, especially as people are learning. While people are learning and they're creating silicone molds and the mold has a mistake and you're like, oh, well, I guess this is forever. Or you create a urethane or an epoxy-based resin piece and you love it, but you don't want to live with it anymore. You know, where does that go? So trying to find biodegradable, sustainable solutions for some of these problems, I just really want us to be opening up a discourse for this. So that's the end of my slideshow. I would love to continue if anybody wants to stay on and continue having questions or discussions. If anybody wants to unmute themselves, I don't think I have it set up where you are automatically muted. So You are welcome. Sasha, in the meantime, silicone can be cut up and used as filler, although sometimes I have heard mixed feedback on that. It needs to be very, very clear, needs to be very, very perfectly cleaned in order to do that, because sometimes you'll have delamination of bits of silicone inside it. I have a meat grinder that I have not yet experimented with chopping up my own silicone, but I really, really want to do that. How long do the molds last, Mia? I have had a mold sitting in my studio that I haven't touched since January, and it's perfect. It's in the same condition that I left it. I have material that I've had sitting in my studio for 2 years now and haven't had any problem with it. Casting wax into it, Rachel, yes, you can cast wax. You would want to, yes, you would want to freeze the mold first. I think I meant to have a whole slide about the things that you can cast into this material, but it's definitely in the PDF where I go over some of the suggested materials that you can look at, that you can try out. So I have experimented with casting monster clay into that, and that's how I actually made the casting itself initially. Was I had the old sculpture that I had made with Sculpt-A-Mold. I made a mold of that. I froze that mold, and then I melted up my monster clay and I poured that right back in. I've experimented with wax. Wax and monster clay have similar melting temperatures. You just want to make sure that it's frozen if you're going to be doing any experimenting with this. That means also that it opens up the world of like chocolate casting and like butter. And I'm really into sculpting with cheese. So this has been like a huge thing for me to try to figure out how to merge my worlds of like mold making with flexible molds into working with cheese. So finally, good reason to live in Minnesota. I can put the large molds outside for freezing. Exactly. My freezer has a designated shelf that I try to keep like as a floating shelf where I can always stick stuff in there. But wax, it's huge. Like the fact that you can cast these hot materials in there is very, very exciting. I'm just going back over the chat to make sure that I haven't missed anything else. Sasha, thanks for bringing up the silicone. And Sasha's actually going to be doing a bunch of research on micro and nanoplastics, which is something that I feel like we should all be caring about, considering the fact that we're, you know, consuming plastics at this point. So this is where I get a little bit into like the evangelism aspect of this. I kind of shout from the rooftops about this material whenever I can, and maybe it gets annoying, but like, I feel like if we can move away from creating so much plastic waste, I'm willing to be a fanatic about it. So are there any other questions that I can address at all right now? Or can we just continue having discussions happen? Ooh, Patty says, just be careful, it's gelatin, so critters, including pets, might find it attractive to eat. Had a friend's dog go for it once. My Mastiff is really strange in that he like obeys my expectations that he only eats dog food unless we are giving him something. So he's never chewed anything up, but please, yeah, be careful because it's gelatin. Like I bet it smells really interesting to them, and it would probably be really fun for them to chew on that. So I can go ahead and add that link real quick. I think I can do it real quick. Maybe copy link. I have just the one PDF that I provided, Alvaro, but I do have links to further resources in that PDF. So I have a vocabulary list and a shopping list that's part of the linked information. And then, you know, if anybody's at all curious about having further discourse on, you know, material experimentation, I've got another really big catalog where I've kept track of all of the different materials that I've tried, including all of the different materials that I've tried within this mold. So Nicole, maybe I covered this. What's the best alternative to microwaving? So Sasha and I were on the phone the other day, and she just decided that she was going to whip up a batch of it to experiment. She's been playing around. So Sasha's really into sort of trying to tap into the aesthetic properties of this material as a casting material. So she's taking stuff like plaster or silicone molds, and she's pouring it directly, the glycerin gelatin directly into those. And she's getting some really neat differences in like the matte versus the glossy. She just used her hot plate while she was sitting in her studio, just had it in front of her and kept an eye on it so that as soon as it was completely incorporated, she was able to pull that off of the heat. Betsy, thank you so much. It's my pleasure. Double boiler, I think, is a good way to go. I don't know, Sasha, if you were using your double boiler for that, or if you just were keeping an eye on it. But I think the microwave is the easiest way, but not everybody has like a microwave in their studio. I'm actually hoping to teach like real life workshops on this someday when we can be together again in person. With schools and stuff. You know, I'm really fond of the Cal State Northridge sculpture program and really grateful to them. And I would love to find ways that I can give back. So I'm hoping to, at some point, go up there with this workshop and maybe have like a double boiler situation. Maybe if I get fancy, I'll bring like a little mini microwave. Haven't figured that out yet. But in any case, having just a hot plate means that you can travel with this material. You can whip it up for students on the fly. And I want to be making this whole presentation practical and understandable enough for children, for students, so that people can be putting these YouTube videos up and learning from them, and would very much be appreciative if anybody wants to continue collaborating on this. So does anybody else have questions? Can I ask some questions about the polymer plaster? You know, I haven't done like a ton of research on all of the different polymer plasters. I haven't done a ton of research on like what the polymer, I've heard different things about the polymers being based on different actual chemical breakdown. Like at one point I heard somebody say that aqua resin is based off of a latex system. I'm not sure if that's the case. I don't know if anybody on here has messed around a little bit more with aqua resin in particular. Their build is non-toxic materials. So thank you, whoever is the CSUN sculpture person there. Their build is non-toxic materials. So I'm not sure what the basis of that is, but if it's about the practical application of the polymer modified gypsum, I'd be happy to speak on my experience with it. If you have questions, or if anybody else has any other questions. Hi, Christian. Sebi, did you have any particular questions about what you can do with it? Yeah, so the reason why, like I mentioned, like sculptures being made in Vegas, the polymer modified gypsum is part of that solution. What they'll often say when you're looking at like the actual description of how to use the products, they'll often say that you still need to seal it in some way. So what I've been experimenting with is using epoxy. They've got a product called XTC3D that's smooth on cells, and it's epoxy. And I really like that stuff because it creates a really thin coating, but it water seals it. And it also adds the capacity of being able to make something really glossy that wasn't maybe glossy before. You can also do some things to modify the gloss if you don't want it to be glossy. Sasha says that she has experimented with aqua resin and it's not waterproof, and she had to seal it with more plastic. So epoxy, another plastic. If anybody has some solutions otherwise, be awesome. I think some people have talked about using it with shellac, which might be an option. Olenka, thank you for sharing that. I'll take a look at whatever that senior mold maker Art Bronze is doing in Berkeley. Kim says that she's waxed polymer modified gypsum before. I'm really taken with the capacity for wax to seal. I'm interested in it when it comes to working with cheese, because you can preserve cheese in that way. So that's something that I'm getting into. But yeah, I think, Kim, I would love to see how that worked for you, because that's not a plastic. Like, that's definitely a viable option. I don't know if anybody's experimented with shellac, but I have some in my studio, so maybe I should try that at some point. that might be a more non-toxic option as well. But yeah, does anybody else have any other questions? Shellac is okay, but you have to keep applying over time. Also, it can discolor your work. It's got like that, I love the color. It's got like a warm kind of buttery yellow kind of color. But yeah, you do need to, just like you would with making sure that your wood stays in good quality, you need to keep sealing it. So Juliana says, I seal plaster positives with shellac for casting with urethane and silicone molds. Yeah, I've seen that done. That seems like a really great way to go. So maybe a viable option for a non-toxic solution workaround there. Cool. Anybody else have any other questions? I am really into the idea of further research in what can be done with making vegan options, vegetarian options for this. I've had some friends that are like, I don't want to try it because I don't buy anything that is meat products. And I had somebody the other day on Facebook, I really appreciated them making a comment. They said, you know, how is this considered an eco-friendly option? How is this considered eco-friendly at all? And because you're using gelatin, and then they said, you know, well, it's from hooves. It's not technically only from hooves. It's from, you know, it's the collagen breakdown, which I go into a little bit more in the PDF. But my mentality about this is that because of the fact that it's a reusable and recyclable material, that means that you buy it once and you can reuse it countless times. I've had the same batches that I just keep reusing and reusing and reusing for all these different projects. And as long as you really, really clean off the surface, you're going to be in good shape. So air bubbles technique in the process of the mold making is a huge other thing that Sasha and I are talking about. Sasha, can you do me a favor and type the piece of equipment that you have, if you don't mind? But it agitates the mold itself. So that's one possible option. The ultrasonicator probe. I think that might be something to look into if you're not using it with a monster clay positive or master. The reason being, like, if there's any bits of jostling that you experience when you're moving the mold, you can end up sort of getting some of those floaties where the surface of the monster clay is disrupted. But I think that there's still a lot of possibility in being able to find ways to either vacuum, use a degasser, use a vacuum, figure something out in order to do that. So can you get solid particles out of the gelatin too if you heat it up and strain it? Yeah, I've had to do that. You just want to be careful not to overheat it, because that's actually the reason why I had that batch that I had kind of burned, was because of the fact that I had tried heating it up. I was using a slow cooker, and a slow cooker surprisingly was too hot for this. So I had it like on really low, and it was still too hot, and it ended up burning it. But now it's got like a different quality to it. Like, it feels different to work with. It feels different to manipulate. Try it out, see what happens. But I had done that so that I could basically strain out all of the solids from when I was early experimenting with this material and wasn't doing such a good job of keeping it clean and tidy. So it's definitely an option. As far as keeping it hot goes, I would just say I would not recommend the slow cooker option unless you've got something that can go really, really low. Look into it. Yeah. Anybody else have any other questions? I said that we would go until 6 because I was like, I don't want to make sure that anybody's, you know, thinking that it was only going to be a short little tiny thing, but this is perfect. I'm sure everybody's got stuff to do this evening. Thank you so much all for being here. I've got a list of thank yous on my PDF because I'm just over the moon grateful to a lot of people that have helped me put this all together. And I'm really, really excited to continue making these videos and sharing them with everybody, and expanding this whole vocabulary of what we can be doing with bioplastics and bio rubbers and everything. So thank you so very much. I'm going to go ahead and end this unless anybody has any other questions, but I'm on Instagram, Emily Blythe Jones, and I'm on Facebook, and you can email me and you can find me on my website. Whatever you need, I am available. I am here for you. Let's talk. So thank you so much. Thank you.